They need to take the deal. The owners have the advantage. And by strike, he means the players strike and they just bleed out of money. And they come back to the table
And imagine for a second if the National Basketball Association were sitting just 60 days away from a devastating labor shutdown that could wipe out the entire upcoming season. It would dominate every headline across the sports universe. Every network would treat it like a 5-alarm fire. ESPN would plaster dramatic countdown clocks across the bottom of the screen. Stephen A. Smith would be delivering daily monologues about it on First Take, raising the temperature with every segment. The sense of urgency would be overwhelming because billions in media rights deals, sponsorship contracts, advertising revenue, and arena partnerships would hang in the balance. Yet here we are with the WNBA facing a remarkably similar crossroads. A potential lockout threatens to derail the 2026 campaign entirely. The risk is real, the timeline is tightening, and the financial implications are enormous. But the worldwide leader in sports, the very network that owns primary broadcast rights and has poured resources into covering the league, remains strikingly quiet. Why the silence? Because inside executive boardrooms, decision-makers understand a difficult reality. The players may not possess the negotiating power many assume they do. Former industry insiders are now speaking openly, cautioning that the current demands on the table may be viewed not as bold strategy, but as unrealistic overreach. When you compare this subdued media response to how similar crises are typically covered, the contrast.
2 months away from starting their season, the NBA that's in bed with Disney, ABC, ESPN, that they wouldn't tell their networks to start talking about their league to get the word out to the public of what's going on.
Welcome to the icy, unsentimental, and brutally calculated world of international sports economics. When a powerhouse broadcast giant like ESPN or ABC pours hundreds of millions of dollars into a professional league, it rarely acts as a neutral observer. Instead, it becomes a finely tuned promotional engine for that product. Storylines are amplified. Controversies are softened or reframed. Studio panels and debate shows are strategically aligned to keep the league embedded in the daily cultural conversation. Protecting ratings protects advertising revenue, and protecting advertising revenue protects the investment. If a league such as the NFL or NBA were staring down a potential labor shutdown, the media apparatus would instantly shift into crisis mode, applying subtle but relentless pressure on both ownership and players to reach a deal. So when ESPN appears largely indifferent to the possibility of a WNBA lockout, that silence speaks volumes. It signals limited financial risk. If players were to strike and the season were suspended, the network could seamlessly swap those broadcast windows with college tournaments, niche competitions, or alternative live programming without suffering catastrophic losses. Executives understand a hard truth. Without Caitlin Clark consistently drawing national attention, the casual mainstream audience rapidly fades. The players may believe they hold powerful leverage over television partners. Yet from the network's perspective, the stakes remain manageable. That imbalance is precisely why former Major League Baseball executive David Samson delivered a stark and sobering warning to the WNBA Players Association. Samson is neither media personality nor emotional supporter. He is a seasoned former president of the Miami Marlins who spent decades entrenched in franchise operations, stadium negotiations, and high-level collective bargaining battles. He understands how billionaire ownership groups respond when profits, valuations, and authority are challenged by organized labor. His message to players seeking close to 30% of league-wide revenue was direct, pragmatic, and stripped of sentiment. Leverage only matters if the
They need to take the deal. The owners have the advantage. And by strike, he means the players strike and they just bleed out of money. And they come back to the table and
They need to take the deal. The owners hold the leverage, and if the players decide to strike, the financial pressure won't land where they think it will. It will land squarely on them. Samson is exposing what he believes is a massive strategic miscalculation in the players' entire approach to negotiations. The players seem convinced that because television ratings have surged over the past year, ownership groups must be anxious, fearful of losing momentum, and ready to concede to keep the spotlight shining. But that assumption misunderstands both the psychology and the balance sheets of billionaires. Most WNBA owners are not dependent on women's basketball revenue to sustain their wealth. These franchises are often side investments within sprawling portfolios that include NBA teams, real estate empires, private equity holdings, and global business ventures. For many ownership groups, the team is a branding asset, a long-term growth play, or even a tax-advantaged investment vehicle, not a primary income stream. If a strike happens, they can simply shut down operations, dim the arena lights, pause expenditures, and wait out the storm. Missing one season would sting emotionally, perhaps reputationally, but financially it would be survivable. Missing multiple seasons? Still manageable for individuals whose net worth stretches into the billions. The players, however, operate in a completely different financial reality. Many are advocating for guaranteed housing provisions because the cost of living in markets like New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle makes stability difficult on current salaries. They rely on each paycheck. A prolonged work stoppage would not be an inconvenience, it would be devastating. This is not an even standoff. It's more like a financial showdown where one side has virtually limitless reserves while the other depends on steady cash flow to stay afloat. But Sampson's most pointed critique wasn't just about leverage, it was about accounting fundamentals. The Players Association has highlighted the hefty expansion fees paid by incoming franchises in Toronto and Portland, arguing that these figures prove the league is flush with cash and that players deserve an immediate share. They see a reported $200 million expansion fee and interpret it as distributable revenue. Sampson counters that this reflects a misunderstanding of how expansion capital works. Expansion fees are typically allocated to existing owners and often reinvested into infrastructure, operating costs, debt service, and long-term growth, not treated as annual basketball-related income subject to standard revenue-sharing formulas. In his view, conflating expansion capital with ongoing operational revenue weakens the union's financial argument and exposes a
Quote, when the Players Association wants to say to owners, you're having expansion fees, relocation fees, you're getting a one-time signing bonus from your broadcast partners. All of those one-time events are not calculated in terms of viability of a business. And the more
That clip right there perfectly captures why these negotiations are collapsing so dramatically behind the scenes. The core issue is a fundamental misunderstanding of how money actually flows through a professional sports league. Expansion fees are not recurring revenue streams. They are one-time capital payments. When a new ownership group spends $200 million to secure an expansion franchise in a city like Toronto, that payment is distributed among the existing owners to offset the dilution of their ownership stake. It is not operating income that can be counted on year after year. It is essentially a single-entry licensing transaction. You cannot responsibly construct a multi-year salary cap system for players based on a temporary spike in expansion cash. That approach contradicts every principle of sustainable financial planning. Because what happens 3 years into a new collective bargaining agreement when no additional expansion teams are joining? What happens when there are no more $200 million checks being written? That revenue source disappears overnight, yet the long-term guaranteed contracts negotiated by the union remain fully binding. If you rely on one-time expansion payments to fund recurring obligations like salaries, travel, training staff, and healthcare benefits, you create a structurally unstable system. The moment new capital stops entering, the financial pressure becomes overwhelming. Ownership groups are attempting to build a stable long-term model grounded in predictable income streams such as ticket sales, sponsorship agreements, broadcasting contracts, and steady market growth. Meanwhile, the Players Association appears focused on maximizing immediate returns by treating expansion fees as if they are permanent revenue. They are pushing to extract value upfront without absorbing the operational risk required to sustain the league. That widening financial gap has led to a proposal the union has publicly framed as a concession, lowering its demand from 30% of gross revenue to roughly 27.5%. However, when owners projected those terms over a decade, the long-term financial outlook raised serious concerns.
Ownership projections indicate the union's proposal could result in approximately $460 million in cumulative losses across the life of the agreement, which continues to be the major reason why a deal still seems some distance away.
A projected $460 million in cumulative losses over the life of the proposed deal. Let that number sit with you for a moment. The Women's National Basketball Association Players Association is effectively walking into negotiations and asking ownership to sign a binding agreement that would, on paper, lock in nearly $500 million in losses. From a strict business standpoint, that's an extraordinary demand. No rational investor agrees to a structure that guarantees red ink. Many executives would sooner pause operations or restructure entirely than accept a deal that mathematically ensures a $460 million deficit. The union is pushing for 27.5% of gross revenue, not net profit, but gross. That means their share would come off the top before arena leases are paid, before front office salaries, marketing budgets, medical staffs, travel costs, and the newly expanded charter flight expenses are covered. In a league that has historically operated on thin or negative margins, removing more than a quarter of top-line revenue dramatically reshapes the financial equation. When margins are already tight, reallocating gross revenue instead of profit can fundamentally change sustainability. Under the league's current counterproposal, however, total compensation for a top-tier star, factoring in revenue sharing and bonuses, could reportedly climb to around $1.3 million by 2026 and approach $2 million by the end of the decade. That would represent a historic jump from today's Supermax contracts, which sit at roughly $249,000. In percentage terms, that's an enormous increase in earning potential, arguably transformative compared to where salaries have stood in prior years. Ownership is framing this as a pathway toward unprecedented financial growth for players. From their perspective, a 300 to 400% rise in compensation reflects meaningful progress tied to projected revenue expansion. But union leadership appears to believe the league's current momentum justifies a more aggressive revenue split. Critics argue they are negotiating as though they hold the leverage of the National Football League Players Association, while operating within a league whose long-term profitability is still developing. Supporters counter that players are the product and deserve a larger share as the league grows. Much of this debate circles back to one undeniable factor: the surge in mainstream attention driven by Caitlin Clark. Her arrival brought sold-out arenas, record-breaking television ratings, and a level of national buzz that forced networks and sponsors to recalibrate their investment. For the first time in years, women's professional basketball dominated sports headlines in a sustained way. The key question now is whether that spike represents a temporary boom or the beginning of durable, multi-year growth. Some argue the league should stabilize this momentum, prove to broadcasters and sponsors that ratings and ticket sales are sustainable over a 5-year horizon, before dramatically restructuring revenue splits. Others believe this is precisely the moment to capitalize, locking in structural gains while attention is high. The tension lies between short-term leverage and long-term stability. If negotiations escalate into a labor stoppage, the stakes grow even higher. Owners with diversified portfolios could absorb losses more comfortably than players who depend on seasonal income. Broadcasters like ESPN or parent corporations such as the Walt Disney Company have alternative programming options. A prolonged standoff could risk slowing the league's current momentum at a pivotal cultural moment. Ultimately, this isn't just a financial dispute. It's a high-stakes negotiation over leverage, sustainability, and belief in the league's trajectory. Are the players overestimating the permanence of recent growth? Or are ownership groups understating profitability through accounting structures that minimize reported gains? In modern sports economics, the truth often lives somewhere between headline numbers and balance sheets. One thing is certain: the future of the WNBA will be shaped not just by on-court brilliance, but by what happens in boardrooms